Hi, folks. Welcome once again to the Bodleian Library and my library. And today we're going to talk a little bit about early modern political theory beginning in the 1500s. Now, we're going to be dealing with Machiavelli on Thursday in discussion, and so I'm not going to deal with him in this lecture. I'm going to be dealing with, though, instead with the issues that are surrounding Machiavelli, all about monarchs. And as we move into the era of the Reformation, the issue of resistance theory, as well as the issues of how a monarch's authority is constituted, and that's going to lead us into issues of social contract and natural law. So here we go, folks. Now, one of the things that you have to deal with when you're trying to understand political theory of any given period is to know what it is they think is the foundation of government. And in the early modern period, one of those key issues is about monarchy. Now, most of the natural law arguments, some that we've read in C.S. Lewis, were in fact pretty much commonplace, having been popularized by Aquinas. And so by the time we get into the 1500s, most people who think about government, I mean, not the average peasant who may or may not be able to read, but those who think about such things in law and in government kind of know these and accept them. And they have this concept that you see kind of here that about the laws of nature being the bedrock underneath the foundations of all of these different forms of government. Now, this particular cartoon is obviously talking about our government with the we the people, but that's the same kind of mindset. They accepted Aquinas on his ideas about both Aristotle and Augustine. That was very commonplace. Natural law was, unlike what we are going to see later on with Grotius, at this point in 1500, is placed there by God into man and can be accessed by reason. There's still very much this belief in rationality. Now, the wars of religion are going to put all of man's claims of rationality and his powers of reason that the Renaissance has just loved. And the wars of religion are going to kind of put paid to that idea, and they're not really going to buy that as much in Grotius's day. God's moral law, the Ten Commandments, is the same thing as the natural law, really. Now, like I said, Grotius is going to go into new theories on this later on. And he's not going to entirely agree with this kind of concept, but I talked about that last time. We're going to see a necessity of government, though. All of them are going to really agree with Augustine on this, that man needs government of some sort for various reasons. Calvinist theorist Robert Bolton is going to see government as the prop and the pillar of all states and kingdoms. In other words, God creates kingdoms, but you have to have something that holds it together, and that's the job of the government, okay? Man's corruption is part of it, but the Calvinists are also going to see government as a positive good, which is really interesting because Calvinists are rather pessimistic about most things. But the idea is that government can lead man into doing good things and make him better. Both Protestant and Catholic, though, will agree that government is necessary, government is needed, and is instituted by God. Protestants are going to focus more on, except for the Calvinists, but even them to a point, that coercion, the government's bearing the sword, is more about post-lapsarian world rather than always part of man's nature. And both government and society, we're going to go back to the Aristotelian concept about them being natural to man. Now, the question is, where does political power derive from? Where is it seated? Where does it come from? And how then can you challenge it later on? Was it from the surrendering of individual rights? Well, that's going to be something that's going to be argued by some later on. Was it from the consent of the community as a whole, which so not from the individual but the community, which is a little bit more what you get to see with Hinkmar. Now the reality is there is a monarchical theory of the state that's critical to understand, because it kind of infects the language of everybody in the early modern period. Even when they don't totally agree with the theory, they still use the language of it, and we still do. The key here is the concept of the body politic. Now, we've already talked about Hinkmar and the idea of this three-pronged theory that supports this three-legged stool that supports monarchy of inheritance, Zadok the priest, the church, and Nathan the prophet, these three figures in the coronation of Solomon. Well, in the 1500s, we start to see more language that's been there before, but it's going to be kind of crystallized in the 1500s, of this concept of the body politic and how it's going to be linked to the monarch. Now, there are a couple of ways to conceive of a state. We tend to think of it more in almost a mechanistic way now. But the medieval world and the early modern world still considered the universe to be more organic. The idea that it's a great machine and it's very mechanical is going to be Newtonian. It's not going to be something that you see prior to Newton's work in the late 1600s. And it's going to be very Enlightenment sort of thinking, to think of it as a machine. God is the great watchmaker who sets it to go, as that's mainly the deist theory. But here you're going to see it as an organic thing. And that's something you still hear echoed in geographic theories of the state. In geography, there are theories that a state has boundaries that evolve over time. Sometimes you get a boundary that's superimposed on a landscape that's just put there by treaty and imposed there. A more natural boundary evolves over time, and is very current and contemporary. And other times, a state will die, and you'll see what we call a relic boundary, a leftover from a state that no longer exists, but you can still sort of feel it there. You can see this in the effects of the Mason-Dixon line and the separation of North and South. But you can also see this in other places. You can go to Italy or to France, and you can still feel that this is not, at one point, this was not a unified state, because certain areas have very distinctly different cultures than other areas. I'm thinking northern and southern Italy, for instance, and other places where you can see the same kind of relic boundary. Now, all of that's to say, the concept of an organic state, one that has a life cycle to it, and a life of its own, is not something that's just an early modern concept. It's something that shows up still in geopolitical theory. And we even use the term the body politic now. Now, the concept of how this worked with the monarch was used more in England than it was elsewhere, okay, on the continent. But certainly it was still used on the continent. And now, the first clear articulation of this concept of the body politic we see in the Treasons Act of 1351 in England, and in which they're going to talk about how treason is betrayal of the king's person, and thereby betrayal of the entire kingdom by betraying the king. This is why Henry VIII can accuse his wives who've committed adultery of treason. Okay, it's not just adultery they're accused of, but they're treason, because the king's body is equal to that of the body of the nation. The Chief Justicer, Sir William de Charshall of the King's Bench, is going to be one of the major authors of this, and it's going to talk about this concept of treason as betrayal of the body politic and betrayal of the king's body, and those two things being kind of interchangeable. And you see the same thing in Christine de Pizon's book. And Aurora, this is something for you to consider, of the book of the body politic that she publishes in 1407. and very overtly political work, a little different from what she does in the book of the City of Ladies. But she, again, is talking about this connection between monarch and the kingdom and this almost tangible, organic kind of system. So John Fortescue in The Governance of England is also going to talk about some of this. He's going to use the body politic phrasing and uses this and the concept of the separation of the king's divine authority and his physical body. In other words, he has a physical body over here, but what his divine authority is associated with is this body politic. It's not about his body. Don't tell Henry VIII. Okay. And that the body politic in his writings is firmly established as the realm itself, not his physical body. So we're separating these a little bit here. Now he's moving less from the concept of theology into the concept of jurisprudence, this idea of the king's justice is the justice for the entirety of the body politic. And without it, it just simply doesn't work. Okay. And yes, I'm kind of teaching to the room here with my hands again. Now, this translates into the theories about the state. Now, the clearest articulation of this is with Edmund Plowden in 1579. Plowden is going to build on what Fortescue has already said and what you get from some medieval sources about, and he's going to articulate that there are two bodies. Okay, and if you get really into this, there's a great book called The King's Two Bodies. It's not from the 1570s; it's from the early 2000s, and is on this particular thing. The body politic exists perpetually for the common good. In other words, once again, like Fortescue, he's taking it away from, this is not about the king's physical body. This body politic can't be killed unless, obviously, somebody else comes in and conquers the whole country and subsumes it into something else. But even then, it doesn't completely dissipate, because one of the things that we find very easily is that places like Ukraine, which had been part of the old Soviet Union and Russia before that, still had still to see themselves as a very distinct people. Ukraine does, separate and apart from Russia, which has controlled it for centuries. So even if you've been conquered, that doesn't mean that the body politic, this drawing together of a nation, is going to completely dissipate. And you can put a star by this in your notes if you want, and link this to where we're going to go with nationalism in the weeks to come. This is not flesh. It can't die, really. It can, like I say, if the conquest is thorough enough, but even there it gets a little sketchy. We can go talk about, once again, Welsh and Scots nationalism in the modern age. Okay. But then the king also has a body natural, and this is where Fortescue comes in. That this body natural was subject to infirmities. It could grow old, it could die, and that was the body natural. That's linked to the body politic, and in fact, they're very closely linked, because when the king's physical body begins to deteriorate, one of the things that these theorists are going to argue is that you see an equal deterioration in the nation as a whole. And one of the great examples here is George III. Now, this first picture is George III's coronation portrait in 1760. Young, virile man at the height of his powers. He's a young king in 1760. And he's going to reign for a long time. He's the third longest reigning monarch in British history, right behind the current Queen Elizabeth II, and Victoria, who's now second. He's going to be there for a long time. But the problem is that he has tremendous mental illness in his lifetime. It begins in the late 1780s, but really doesn't hit full force until about 1810. And in 1810, he is going to be declared mentally incompetent, and they'll appoint a regent, his eldest son, to rule in his stead. The bottom portrait there is George III during the period of his regency, and they don't even look like the same man. Not only is he aged, you'll notice there's nothing there in the eyes. He is going to be at Windsor. He's going to be confined to Windsor. His wife, who was married to for 60 some odd years and really did adore, he's not going to even recognize. There's a lot of people who think it was porphyria. We don't know. Trying to diagnose things that are removed of 200 years is a really dangerous ballgame, when they don't even write symptoms the way we do. But one of the things that you can see is the period of the Regency, while it gives rise to lots of romance novels, is not always a stable era of British politics. It's going to be a period filled with instability, with government that doesn't fully trust the Prince Regent. And so you've got a weak monarch, and therefore you've got a weak state. The medieval world showed this very, very clearly, when you had a government that was even more tied to the person of the king. In George III's day, Parliament can act without the king if they need to, and sometimes they do. But in the medieval period and early modern periods, that's a whole lot harder to do, certainly in the 1500s. And probably the best example is this quote here from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that's from the 1100s. In 1135, Henry I dies and the throne passes to his nephew, and his daughter Maud is going to argue with Stephen for the throne for a period of civil war that's often called the Anarchy in English history. It's that bad. And after a long treatise of what all is happening, of brigandry and barons who are mistreating the populace and castles raiding and all kinds of things, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by monks, includes this extraordinary comment that really kind of damns Stephen's whole reign. They say, when the barons realized that Stephen was, kind of basically a pushover, that they did whatever they wanted. And so they said openly that Christ slept and his saints. Such things and more than we can say, suffered we 19 winters for our sins. How bad does it have to be for monks to say that Christ and his saints are asleep and not answering their prayers for deliverance? You have a weak king, a king who in his person, in his body, is a weak and spineless man, and therefore the country is in chaos. Body politic and the body natural were tied together. Now, not everybody bought all of this. One of the great dissenting voices was Sir Edward Coke. And he argued that the immortality of kingship was simply man-made and not divine at all, which is something our founders are going to eventually latch onto, and so is John Locke. Now, the ramifications, though, of this, Edward Coke's going to get pulled out later on by guys like Locke at the end of the 1600s, but not in the 1500s. In the 1500s, most people think this is immutable. Now, there's some serious ramifications. One is that if you have you need a united body politic, just like you need a king's body natural that's whole, then you need a united body politic on religion, and hence religious wars. And we're also going to see that any attack on the monarch is considered an attack on the nation. And even Edward Coke would have agreed with that one, which is, of course, what we see with World War I and the assassination of the heir to the throne. That's why you see the fact that Prince Charles contracting COVID-19 was a serious issue for the British. Even though he's in 71, he's in extraordinarily good health with only mild symptoms. They've also been really careful and very concerned, simply because, well, this is the heir to the throne. Now, that's the basics of monarchical theory. But there were also other pieces to this about what was the king's authority now that he was in control, now that he was on the throne. What does it mean? And how did he get the authority? How exactly did that work? Because most people were not listening to Hincmore anymore. And you'll see some of this discussed in Machiavelli. He's talking about where the king's authority comes, where the prince's authority comes from. Now, Divine right absolutism says that they got their authority.
Camelot.
And I'm going to stifle c'est moi, mais c'est moi. They're going to say that the monarch's authority is directly from God. Okay, well, that's what we expect, right? I love the kind of Monty Python, here's God in his kingdom who's now given authority to the monarch on earth. And only God limits the monarch, not even the law. The law is beneath the monarch and divine right absolutism. Spain, France, Russia are all going to perpetuate this. Prussia will do this as well. Austria, sometimes. It kind of depends on who's you're talking about. And the Stuart monarchs in England are actually going to do this, at least the early Stuarts till we get to William and Mary. Now, the reality is that there was reality of this, and kings who behaved in this fashion before you get theory. Theory followed reality, okay, in the case of divine right and trying to explain this thing. In 1627, you get the removal of all the noble, 1626, Richelieu under Louis XIII is going to remove the noble castles from France. He blows them up, quite literally, takes cannons and blows holes in the sides of them to remove the threat of the nobility to the king. And with their threat gone, then, well, the king's more absolute. I'm going to tell them that they can't duel. They can't do other things that would allow them to create armies to rebel. In 1653, we get the Diet of Brandenburg, which is going to actually give sole taxation authority to Frederick William, the King of Prussia. In other words, you don't have to listen to our imperial diet, our meeting of nobility that for centuries you've had to, but we're going to give it to you now largely at the insistence of Frederick William. In Denmark and Norway will actually write the Kongloven, which means the King's Law, in 1665, which said straight up that the monarch was above all human laws, with no judge who could judge his person. And the czars will simply just do it, and they won't even have an assembly of any kind until 1905, after the revolution in January of 1905. The reality is that in all of these cases, the form was there before the theory. The theory came later. So what did they theorize when the theorists finally sat down to try and justify these absolutist regimes? And this is something to remember, that many of these guys are going to still be writing in the period that we designate the Enlightenment. And we talk about Voltaire and some of these other guys. For, in fact, the Enlightenment who are criticizing absolutist theory. There's also going to be people who are writing theory for absolutism. Now, the first of these theories comes from the Catholics, and the Catholics are going to argue for what we call translation theory. Francisco Suarez and Robert Bellarmine is going to be one of the chief advisors to the Pope on matters of science. He's going to argue with Galileo and these sorts of things. They're going to argue that the powers of the king derive from an act of transference of political power from the community to the king, okay? This translation of power, this concept, gave some authority to the overall community. But after the French Revolution, the Catholics are not going to talk about this anymore. Okay. Certainly you're not going to get any Habsburg monarch who's going to talk about translation theory any longer in the wake of the French Revolution, because it gave authority to the community below to rebel, which until you get to the French Revolution, the Catholic Church always kind of tacitly acknowledged. Now, designation theory comes in first in the 1590s through the 1640s, and we see this being popular there. And it hits a resurgence in the wake of the French Revolution. Thomas Morton at Cambridge is going to talk about this. Now, what this theory is going to say is it's going to deny that the community translates authority from God in any way, shape, or form. Because if you say that the community translates authority, there is this obviously idea that you're giving them the authority to rebel, which the divine right absolutists really don't want to do. And once they see that loophole, they'll back away from it. Instead, the community selection of a king was the mere designation that the choice that God had already made. Okay. And I mean, you may be designating this person, but God's already picked. And so your authority here is null and void here. God gives the king his power, and God is already chosen, and he's just letting you kind of see this. Okay. This was more concerned with kings in power than new princes. And new princes are really what Machiavelli is going to talk about. Now, Machiavelli talks about a lot of this. You'll see, you're going to hear echoes of both translation theory and designation theory in what you're reading in Machiavelli. Patriarchalism is not a new theory, okay, that compares the theory, the power of the monarch to the power of the father. We saw that with Plato. We see discussions of that in Aristotle. And this is the idea that the right of the king, jus regio, followed from the rights of the father, patrium, okay? They use scripture, they use parts of Aristotle, even though Aristotle really doesn't like this, but they'll misuse him for this. And it's really the favorite argument of most kings in power in the 1800s, and certainly in the 15 and 1600s. They loved this. They compare the state to the family and the king to the father. And it assumes a level of authority by the king, by the father. And when you get feminists talk about patriarchy, this is usually the theory they mean, okay? They won't put it in this kind of terms, but this is really what they're referring to, okay? I'm sorry, that came back. Now, they'll make some distinctions between domestic power and political power as they do this, at least to a certain point. Not always, but at least part of the time they'll do that. And that's going to be important because it gives some difference to some of their theories when they do that. Adam's going to be seen as the first king, not as the first father, although that's true too, and they'll talk about it, but merely as the first king. You get playwrights like who will talk about this in there. Shakespeare's going to love this in King Lear. You see it in some of his plays like Edward III. We'll also see writers like Savaria in the 1590s who are going to argue that supreme authority becomes with man's, and the first progenitors, the first founding fathers were kings, and we start to see where we use that language of founding fathers very much bound up in this. The probably clearest example of this was Robert Filmer. He's not the earliest proponent of this idea, but he's certainly the most often cited. Yeah, now, once again, I want to hit this real clear because patriarchalism is not going to be articulated this way in the Middle Ages. This is an early modern function of how they do things because, quite frankly, nobody's power is that absolute in the Middle Ages, and not even the popes most of the time. Power is very contentious, and there are lots of limitations on monarchical power, not the least of which by the church. But the Reformation changes a lot of that. And the Protestants are just as firmly about the authority of the Father, in fact, more so sometimes than the Catholics. Because Catholics are going to argue that fatherhood is not as important as serving God. And you can do that as a priest and never have earthly children. So this is going to be a change here. But back to Sir Robert Filmer. There he is. Sir Robert Filmer is going to be one of the key guys in all of this. And quite frankly, he's the guy that Locke's going to be arguing with. All right. He's going to write several different works, most denying the political power being in the people. That's the key here. And that's the key of patriarchal idealism here in terms of royal theory, is that you don't want anything to go to the people because that gives them the right to rebel and resist. Patriarchia, which is written in 1640 and then published again in 1680. Now notice it's written in 1640 as support for Charles I and his assertions of royal power. But it's republished in 1680 to try and justify what James II is doing, Charles I's son. And it becomes a provocation for Locke is going to write in 1690 to refute Filmer. In fact, the whole first treatise does precisely that. He denies scriptural precedent for self-government. Now, he's going to kind of neglect a whole couple of things to do that. The whole concept of the tribes in Old Testament history, he's going to try and argue that there was no king in Israel and that's why everything was bad. He's going to argue that the first government was monarchy, and that was the monarchy of the father. Okay. And this is going to be the key piece in most absolutist theories. A homily against disobedience and willful rebellion in 1570 is going to be one of these sermons. One of the things that we see is a lot of political theory in England comes out of sermons as well as speeches to Parliament. Homilies were commentary on scripture, and they were permitted without you being licensed to preach by the government and the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so you could offer these. And so you got a lot of these different homilies kind of said, and these commentaries that were really insights into religious and political thinking of the day. Commentary on Romans 13 is this particular one here, and that was also a very favorite topic for homilies. And this particular one is going to argue that all governments are instituted by God and rebels are in eternal danger. Something that's very much present in the whole concept of what Filmer is saying in Patriarchia. And the unrighteous prince is an instrument of God's wrath. He's not somebody who can be rebelled against because he's there to punish you for your sins, which is the same point of view that you see represented in the Anglo-Saxons Chronicles reaction to King Stephen. Now, one of the most prominent British theorists on absolutism is going to come from the king himself, James VI of Scotland, James I of England. He becomes king of Scotland with the deposition of his mother, the deposing of his mother from the crown when he was about a year and a half old. And so he serves for a fairly long time as king in Scotland, a shorter period of 20 odd years in England, but certainly that's no slouch of that. He is a scholar king. He's a very learned man. The major problem for England is that while he's going to be very, very learned, he's not particularly learned about the ways that England governs itself. He's got to learn it in other things. And he writes several different works. There is James in his younger years when he's particularly prolific. And his most significant one in terms of political theory is going to be The True Law of Free Monarchies, which he writes in 1598. And it's going to be kind of the core of a speech he makes to Parliament in 1610, which rather ticks Parliament off, actually. And he sees, once again, the ideal state has the king as the pater patriae. Once again, we're going to pull out of Latin. Pater patriae, Augustus Caesar's favorite nickname, favorite title that the Senate gives him is pater patriae, father of the fatherland, father of the country. And that he is the head of the body of subjects. Very much what we hear there is that body politic language again, and the connection of the king as in his body to the body politic of the whole country. And here we have him in this situation, and it's this very reminiscent of the way that or kind of foreshadowing of the way that we're going to hear Hobbes talk about the body politic.
It's true. It's true.
The king should keep
The crown has made it clear. The climate must be perfect all the year. A law was made a distant moon ago.
Hi guys. Sorry for the musical interlude that didn't realize was there and couldn't figure out how to turn off. Okay. The ideal state has the king as the founding father, as we were talking about. The king is supposed to keep order and encourage righteousness. So once again, we're still seeing that Psalm 72, that same Deuteronomy 17, that same kind of concept of the responsibility of a Christian king, because all of this is taking place within the kind of framework that I am a Christian king over a Christian nation. The concept of a country that has multiple religions in it is really not part of this. And that's one of the reasons why you see so many wars of religion. Now, James VI is going to argue that, or James I of England, is going to argue that there's absolutely impossible for any king to ever be bad enough to justify removal. It's just not possible that any king would be that bad. Now, of course, he's a sitting king, so of course this is what he thinks. And he says that a removal will not improve the kingdom, and it will merely make things more chaotic. Now, he also is going to be very clear to say that a coronation does not constitute a contract, and that only God can judge the king concerning his promises. Now, be very clear what he's doing here. He's saying that my coronation oath is not a contract between me and the people. Now, this is contrary to the kind of writing that you're going to get in England with Edmund Plowden in 1579, because he sees the coronation as the contract between the people and God and the king. That's what the oath is. But James VI is from Scotland, and he doesn't agree. He thinks only God can judge the king. Now, the English don't think this. This is what's going to lead to all the problems. Is the English think that the king is subject to the law. Hence, Magna Carta, and why they're also going to have civil war. The people swear allegiance to the king and his heirs and his posterity. That's part of the coronation that James wants to focus on here, not his own oath to the people and to God. Now, continental absolutist theory will go in different directions. The French monarch was the absolutist model for all of Europe, and a lot of the theorists will center on this. One of the key pieces is going to come from the great aid of the French monarch Louis XIII, and that is Cardinal Richelieu. Of course, this is Richelieu that you see here on the right, and on the left is Louis XIII, who, unlike what Alexandre Dumas would have us believe in the Three Musketeers, they actually got along rather well. And this was really very much realpolitik kind of advice, similar to what we see in Machiavelli. We can kind of see his influence 100 years on to what Richelieu writes to Louis XIII. Now, the reality is that Louis XIII and Richelieu, though Richelieu is quite a bit older, he's going to serve as regent when Henry IV, Louis XIII's father, dies, in conjunction with Louis XIII's own mother, Marie de Medici. But the thing is here that Richelieu's advice to Louis XIII will not go eventually to Louis XIII, because Richelieu dies in 1642 and Louis XIII dies in 1643. They only die about a year apart. It's going to be wind up being more in the hands of, in fact, Louis XIV, who certainly is going to be an absolutist monarch. Jean Dumas is going to be a French legal scholar, and Dumas is going to be a very key figure in some of this. He's going to write the civil law in its natural order, and he's going to write on divine right as well. And his natural law, he's going to see as the basis of monarchy and social hierarchy. This is the key. That this natural law, this is the way things are, this is the way human society works. And now we can hear part of why Grotius is going to actually separate natural law from divine law, because divine law doesn't have a social hierarchy, okay? Whereas he's going to see natural law very much having such. He uses the patriarchy arguments, very much what we hear in Filmer, and he's going to be writing after Filmer. He sees people as equal before God, but are assigned these different stations in order for society to work, and therefore they must accept it as such. In other words, it's an argument for the social hierarchy that France has in spades. The king is the key to justice and the source of law. Now, notice, king's not just above the law, he is the source of law. Something that Shakespeare is eventually going to say put in Richard II's mouth in his play Richard II is, the law is in my mouth. In other words, I speak the law. The law is me. It's nobody else. And it's certainly a sentiment that we're going to see from Louis the 14th. There are other proponents of continental theory and absolutism. Um, one of the notable ones here is Jacques Bousset. He's once again a bishop as well as a politician. He's going to be heavily involved in the French government. And it's going to be kind of one of the classic statements of divine right theory for France, and usually one of the ones that's taken up as part of this. His work is going to be called Politics Drawn from the Very Words of Holy Scripture. Now, this is 1709, like smack dab in the middle of the Enlightenment, okay? So remember what I'm saying here is that they're going to talk about government. They're not talking about government from the point of view of Montesquieu or Voltaire. They're talking about government with rational and analytical methods to justify absolutism. Now, what does Bousset say? Well, he says that first, that the king's person is sacred and authority is directly from God. Okay, so we're getting shades of the two bodies thing here going on here. The king was God's minister, and princes were working directly from God's principles. And since the kings were God's ministers, the king or the prince, which is another word that they use often here. This is why you get Machiavelli's book called The Prince, is because the prince is just the ruler, the first citizen, princeps, which is the Latin for term. That he has to be obeyed on principle because he's God's minister, and therefore you can't disobey him. And that's the sense that you'll get here. God is ruling through the kings, and kings must use their power, therefore, for the good of their people because they're ruling in the place of God. Now, he's not really dealing with kings who might be tyrants. He's not dealing with that. He says the king is not above the law, though, because his sin would destroy the law. So he is going to still require righteousness of the king, but he's not really certain. He doesn't totally discuss how you're going to get that righteousness necessarily. He doesn't see any separation of the king and the state. Of course, he's writing in 1709 at the height of the power of Louis XIV. Just in case you don't know this, kind of for reference, Louis XIV is going to reign from 1643 until 1715. He's going to be on the throne for 72 years. Current Queen of Great Britain has not quite caught him yet. She's 1952 to 2020. So she's 68 years now on the throne. So she's got about 4 more, provided all goes well, because she's not young now. She turns I want to say she turns 94 this year. I think she's 93 currently and turns 94. Because she's 5 years. No, she's born in 1926. So she died. She turns 94 in April, and then Prince Philip turns 99 in June. Okay, no wonder they're worried about their health. Anyway, sorry guys. The duties of the king are to preserve the state. So he does have duties. He's got to maintain a good constitution. He's got to use his wealth and his resources and his arms and his counsel, all of those things to do his job well. He's got to do this. That's his job. And Bousset seems to think that there's absolutely a king would do this because, after all, Louis XIV is. The trouble is that Louis XIV's successors are not going to be particularly great kings. He sees them as needing to defend the state, making good use of the resources. And the Constitution here is a maintenance of the laws and to maintain the laws. Now, the trouble is that that's not actually happening in France. France, by the time we hit the revolution, is going to have a total of 237 separate law codes. Bureaucracy's got a fair amount of corruption in it that Louis XIV is not really going to root out. Certainly gets worse under his successors, but he certainly is growing parts of it under his as well. He's also going to argue that you for just wars, not for ambitious conquest or pillage or jealousy. Now, this is really a fascinating argument for him to make because Louis XIV makes a lot of has a lot of wars, most of them for ambitious conquest. Now, by the end, Louis is going to say that he has loved war too much, and perhaps Bossuet is actually echoing some of that. But the reality is that this is very trouble that Louis is not embodying just war theory in a lot of ways. Well, that's the end of where we're going to go with this one. The next one's going to talk directly about resistance theory, but I wanted to get you through kind of the basics of absolutist theory and monarchical theory before we head into Locke and Hobbes. We're going to change the whole discussion amongst them, as well as the concept of resistance theory. I'll see you next time.